Today is officially the day of the NFL legal tampering period where deals can be agreed upon by principle but not official until Wednesday on the start of the new league year. Could the Denver Broncos make a big-time push for Chandler Jones? Not to mention, the Broncos already took care of two in-house options. They'll be back in 2022. What does that mean? And much more. You get that on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Happy Monday. Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On NFL Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us, we cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked On Network and 9 News. Broncos country, thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Sayre and I, we have you covered 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an offseason. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format. You can watch us here on YouTube if you're a brand new viewer, or if you've been watching for a long time and haven't subscribed or hit that follow button yet, hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. Sarah, hey, this is a big week for us. It's a big week for the National Football League, the rest of the teams and the hosts here at the Locked On Podcast Network. Free agency kicks off this week, my friend. The legal tampering period, it begins today, and the Broncos have already gotten a little busy in terms of some in-house guys. Could they make some big moves here today, my friend?
I think so. I really do, Cody. I feel like we're going to see an aggressive George Paton, especially now that, hey, I don't know if everybody knows this, but Russell Wilson is QB1 of the Denver Broncos, baby. Let's go. Let's get after free agency. If I was George Paton, Cody, which is a lot of how I approach kind of my takes on these situations for those that are listening and are just starting to kind of tune in, it's free agency. You're jumping on board the Locked On Broncos podcast. Thank you for doing that. I like to look at things from the perspective of, hey, if I was George Paton, like this is what I would do. And it's not all personal preference. Some of the stuff is kind of reading tea leaves and aggregating information. But at the same time, if I was George Paton, Cody, I would be going all in on free agency. You just got Russell Wilson. You've got a great roster. Now you've got cap space to move in free agency. I would be getting after big time targets starting right away.
Well, and the Broncos have already gotten busy in a sense in terms of taking care of some in-house guys and really guys that need tendered. And so obviously George Paton on Sunday getting to work, tendering one of the key guys here, Andrew Beck. He's back on a 1-year extension here with the Broncos, and Calvin Anderson. And all we got to do is just do the shush emoji. He's very excited about being back, but we can talk about this. They also didn't tender two other guys. We'll talk about that coming up here in a little bit. But, for Andrew Beck here, Sarah, I think this is big. And the reason I say that, look, this might be one of the most underrated moves of the Broncos offseason here so far, because I think what the Broncos plan to do with Andrew Beck in this offense is very under wraps. It's very kind of top secret because we haven't seen much from Andrew Beck in this offense. We haven't seen much utilization. I do want to encourage Broncos country to go back to the Houston Texans Broncos game from 2019 where Denver was on the road. I want you to watch how Andrew Beck played in that game and how he was utilized. We're going to see a lot of that, and kind of similar, Sarah, as I was pointing out here, and I think I said this on a previous episode months ago, I think that the Broncos could really utilize Andy Janovich and Nathaniel Hackett's offense, kind of as how the San Francisco 49ers do with Kyle Juszczyk. I think that there's going to be something big in store for Beck this season, and it could alleviate some of the concerns about the Broncos maybe need to go get a tight end.
It absolutely could. It's definitely on the list of possibilities. You even called him Andy Janovich, Cody, which I think, that speaks
Did I really
fact,
just call him Andy Janovich? Andrew Beck. Jano is a free agent, though. Andy Janovich is not coming back. Wow.
Oh, man, dang
Why
it.
was I thinking about Jano there, Sarah? I don't know why.
He's a cult hero. He's a cult hero. I get it, Cody. I think everybody in Broncos country misses Jano. But I love the exact thing that you said is exactly where I go back to is that Houston game back in 2019, which you go back and watch that game, it's going to feel like a lifetime and a half ago.
Yes.
Because it was way different. That was the game where we got that picture of Drew Lock and Noah Fant and Dalton Reisner all sitting on the bench, and the Buzz Lightyear game. Yeah, that was when things were going pretty well. But I am looking forward to Beck in the offense. Look, Nathaniel Hackett's offense last year in Green Bay and the last couple years, they actually prioritized the guy in the draft a couple years ago, Josiah DeGuara, who kind of plays a role that I think we might see similar to what Andrew Beck is going to play in Denver potentially. And I think that that's something that you can look at as like a maybe, I don't know if best case scenario is necessarily the way to put that, but maybe he is in that role, the fullback, the H-back, a move guy, a guy who could play tight end for you if need be. I think we didn't really get to see any of what Andrew Beck can do. And I you don't want to overrate guys like that, right? I mean, he's been a good special teams guy, obviously excellent off the field, the Salute to Service Award winner. I mean,
Yeah.
he's very, very good in the community and all those different types of things, but we didn't get to see anything from him offensively. I mean, Pat Shurmur basically was like, yeah, I mean, he can be on the roster for special teams. That's what it felt like. So I feel like we're going to get to finally see a little bit more of what he can do. Everybody, in my opinion, gets a boosted grade on this offense with Russell Wilson at QB. And I just think Andrew Beck is a piece to that puzzle that he might make a few plays a year. You could look back and harken back to the old days, Cody, of Broncos football back in Kyle Johnson, was the fullback and making plays and doing stuff like that as a receiver. I feel like you could see something similar to that since we know Nathaniel Hackett likes to go retro Broncos when he talks about those olden days. I mean, you could see some of that type of stuff from Beck in 2022.
Well, we'll see a little bit more about Andrew Beck here in 2022. Not Andy Janovich. That's a good catch there. Sayre. So I appreciate that. Outside of that, too, for Beck, a big kind of chip on his shoulder to prove like, hey, I can do a little bit more than just be this blocking guy, which look, I think as an offset hybrid H-back, fullback that he's been, even in 2020, he's a pretty good blocker. He helps out, especially on pulling plays, getting out to the edge. And I think for this type of scheme, which is really going to rely a lot on that West Coast outside zone scheme, he's the perfect fit to be able to do it, and he can be utilized as a weapon as well because he's hardly been utilized as a pass-catching threat. I expect that to amplify a little bit more. It might be a little bit of a security blanket here for Russell Wilson, but the Broncos also decided not to bring back a couple of other players who they could have offered tenders to. Does that mean that they're looking in any other direction? Also, does it mean that they're going to be making some moves here on the NFL legal tampering period here today? You get that coming up here in just a moment, but let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode of the show. That's our good friends over there at Built Bar, and it's the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. The bars are covered in 100% milk chocolate. When you take a bite into Built Bar, they're soft and they are easy to chew. It's a very good texture there, not to mention the churro puffs. It's biting into marshmallow fluff with milk chocolate. Highly, highly recommended you try the puff flavors if you haven't done so already. They have 9 amazing original flavors and the puffs, like I had just mentioned. You can check it out at built.com. And if you need a little bit of extra fuel to help get yourself through the day, make sure you go to built.com today because the protein bars, they contain 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. So head to built.com here today, get your hands on a box of Built Bar. And when you go to checkout, make sure you use promo code LOCK15, and that'll get you 15% off your next order at built.com. As we jump into the second half action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Just a reminder, Broncos country, thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. A busy week in store. Make sure you turn on your NFL Denver Broncos free agency coverage over here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Sayre, we were talking about the Broncos tendering Andrew Beck and also bringing back Calvin Anderson, which we're super, super excited about those two moves there. The Broncos made a decision not to tender a couple of other guys, exclusive rights free agents or RFAs. No Deontay Spencer in 2022 for this Broncos team, and no Austin Schlottman, who was, one of those backup interior hybrid guys, could play center, could play guard here for the Broncos. He did a lot of different things in his time here in Denver, but probably his biggest supporter, Mike Munchak, obviously no longer being on the staff, probably had a little bit of something to do with it. But the Broncos going in another direction. So now Deontay Spencer, we knew he was one of those wide receiver options, and he was also the return guy, kick return, punt return. Well, Sayre, looks like the Broncos going to have a brand new returner here in 2022.
It looks like it. It looks like it. And I think that's for the best, right? With all due respect to Deontay Spencer, it just wasn't there in 2021. I feel like we talked about that a lot on this podcast of just like, it wasn't like we were like fishing for things to complain about by any means, but I think that was a glaring area of weakness for the Broncos when you're talking about just the special teams as a whole. There was a point during last season where it felt like, and maybe this wasn't necessarily the case, but I certainly felt this way, that teams were deliberately kicking the ball to Deontay Spencer, kicking it in the field of play to get him to return the ball because they knew that either he wasn't going to be explosive enough to get the ball in favorable field position for the Broncos, or they didn't, they felt like they had a clear matchup advantage against the coverage unit or the blocking unit or whatever. So it just, to me, it felt like it was time for change. Like Deontay Spencer was once a godsend for the Broncos in
Yeah.
2019 as anybody can catch a punt out there, please. And he was great at that. So, and then he had the return touchdown in 2020, obviously against Carolina, but that was really the only major highlight. I feel like it was a little bit of a disappointment in 2021. So this is not altogether surprising, but wish him the best. Obviously, he's probably going to catch on somewhere.
No, I think he will. He could even return to Pittsburgh. One of the things, too, I want to talk about with Deontay Spencer, just he was well loved by the wide receiver room, like very close to Tim Patrick, Cortland Sutton. I mean, those guys have a really strong bond with one another. They do a lot of stuff together in the offseason. Even during season, they're hanging out, they're going places. So, obviously, I want to wish the best to Deontay Spencer in his time. And look, hopefully he can catch on into a role because we were having a similar conversation years ago, Sayre, about Isaiah McKenzie. Just it didn't work out in Denver. And then all of a sudden he went on to have success in Buffalo. We'll see what the Denver Broncos decide to do. But yeah, I mean, Sayre, you're spot on there. The Broncos, they needed a dynamic as a return game. And obviously, the new special teams coordinator, Dwayne Stukes, had come in the opening press conference, said, hey, I'm not here to criticize the other guy in his job. But he said, one thing I did notice is that our return unit was ranked dead last in the National Football League. And so, as you mentioned, there were times where the opposing special teams coaches would scheme to kick the ball 1 yard shy of the end zone, which forces a return. And for some reason, Spencer could not get anything going. And even with the punt return game, I mean, there were a lot of times where, I think in 2021, we saw some instances where he'd fill the punt and he would make a move. And it's like, okay, hey, he might have some space here. And then he'd end up running into one of his own guys. I mean, the way that teams play special teams now, and it's all about kicking to a sideline now. You no longer really see these middle punt returns anymore because they can go left, they can go right. They want to force you to return either on the left sideline, the right sideline, and they want to close that off to where you have to go up that sideline. And if your coverage is good enough, you're going to stop it. You're going to contain it. I mean, the Broncos really need that dynamic return specialist back there, Sayre, to be able to, put the offense, for example, at really good field position, to be able to flip it or to be able to take, an opportunity to score off the offense's plate. When you can score on special teams or defense, man, I tell you what, your chances of winning a football game, they go up significantly. So who could we see maybe step up into that role? I mean, I don't know. I think the first name that comes to mind for many Broncos fans there is, what about KJ Hamler? I honestly don't believe that the Broncos, I don't think George Paton, considering the investment, really for him, they see the talent he has. I don't think they're going to think about putting him as the returner. But then again, I could be entirely wrong. I know that Tom McMahon didn't want to put Hamler back there, but Hamler said himself that he's kind of open to returning. So we'll see what goes.
And I think, on one hand, I would love to see that just because KJ Hamler is the fastest guy on the team when he's healthy, right? So putting him out there, everybody saw that punt return or kickoff return that he had at Penn State, where he was clocked at 50 miles per hour or whatever it was on this. I mean, he was going insane. He's crazy fast. It's a bummer that we haven't been able to really see that on the field. And I'm exaggerating, of course, for those that can't see me or just listening to this. I'm being sarcastic. He didn't actually run 50 miles. I don't even know if that's humanly possible.
Dude, that'd be record breaking. But he did 23 miles an hour. I mean, that's pretty dang good too.
Exactly. It's elite of the elite in terms of the NFL. So I think, for me, it's hard to say with a guy like that. Like, you want his explosiveness and playmaking ability back there, but at the same time, it's like, well, I just want to see him stay healthy for a little bit of time. And getting hit on a punt return is going to diminish those chances that we get to see that.
Guess who that happened to a couple years ago? That was a receiver for the Broncos that was returning. It was a Deshaun Hamilton. Remember the Chiefs game?
That's right.
Pulled up the fair catch, caught it, and still got blasted in the knees. And I mean, unfortunately, after that, really, Deshaun's career was never the same for the Broncos. And I was like, man, that's the one downside about punt return.
It is. And that's the scary part about it. So ideally, obviously, you'd want to go get somebody that could do that for you. And there's a couple of really good ones in this year's draft and everything, like the mid to late round guys that the Broncos could get that could do that. I mean, I know Houston corner Marcus Jones, I believe, Cody, 9 return touchdowns in his college career between Troy and Houston. So I know he's like the holy grail of kick and punt return specialist in the draft, but there's plenty of guys in free agency as well that can do that for you. And so it's like that kind of makes me think maybe the Broncos will prioritize bringing somebody in via free agency who could play in their offense a bigger role than Spencer and return kicks, something that we kind of had called for on a variety of shows last year as well.
Well, my sophomore year of high school, I actually had a kick return for a touchdown to start a
There
game.
you
It was one of the
go.
wildest things ever. And then my coaches kept me back there. And I also had to be the punt returner because, we had two punt returners. You put one back if it goes the right side, the other guy comes up and becomes a blocker. My buddy, my teammate, would intentionally drop them in practice so he wouldn't have to get, he wouldn't be the returner. He'd get fired from it.
Oh my
So guess who had
goodness.
to return? I had to return it. And now look,
Wow.
I wasn't the guy like, I'm not like a McCole Hardman or any of these good returners there, but at least I filled the football. So I only had one return touchdown in my career as a player. I had some pick sixes throughout my career, but man, the return game is hard because you're focusing, you're just hoping, you're just praying to God that your teammates are blocking the gunner so you don't get blown up. So I have so much respect for returners in the NFL. But Sayre, hey, real quick, as we continue on today's episode show, before we talk about Chandler Jones, because that prospect seems real intriguing right now for this Broncos team, seems like a real legitimate possibility in terms of the Broncos have an interest in Jones. I want to talk to you about the legal tampering period. It is officially here today, which means that all the deals that we see, we see all the notifications from Schefter, from Rap Sheet saying, according to sources, this player, this agent confirms that, this player is signing with this team when the new league year begins officially at 4:00 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesday. This is when we see a lot of those come in. They say, hey, they agree to terms in principle. Like right now, the Russell Wilson trade is still agreed upon in terms of principle. It can't actually be official until Wednesday. We're going to see a lot of that here today. Do you think the Broncos make some big moves?
I really do. I think that that's what they position themselves for now with the Russell Wilson trade. Maybe they slow play it a little bit just to kind of get the best deals, but I do think we know this stuff kind of goes on behind the scenes, right? I mean, there's teams have to avoid being, accused of tampering and things like that. But we know that a lot of this stuff have the legal negotiating, legal tampering period, excuse me, whatever they want to call it. We all know that it takes place well before the actual legal negotiation. So, but in terms of just the Broncos speaking, Cody, I feel like we are going to see some big moves. I really do, and it starts with the pass rusher. The tea leaves that you need to read are this. Number one, the Broncos don't have a top 50 pick anymore. They traded those away in the Russell Wilson trade. Typically what we see, because we see teams like this all the time, being teams like the LA Rams or teams like even the Seattle Seahawks, you don't have a first round pick. So you have your quarterback in place. So how do you supplement your roster? Well, you go hard in free agency. You go big in free agency. And a lot of times, even teams that have low cap space, if they don't have those high draft picks, they're going to find ways to move money around so they can go big in free agency, because that's your big move. You no longer have a first round pick. You no longer have a high second round pick. And for the Denver Broncos, even if you trade up, you're not going to get high enough to get a guy that's, I don't know, a starter, like a Patrick Surtain. Let's just throw his name out there. You're not getting a Patrick Surtain type of prospect with whatever you do to maneuver your draft picks. So you have to go in free agency. And I think that's what they're going to do with a guy like Chandler Jones. And you love to see those rumors start to pop up, because you know what that means? That means the Broncos are contenders again, Cody. If they're candidates to sign a guy like Chandler Jones, that means you are a contender in the NFL, which you absolutely love to see it.
Well, speaking of Chandler Jones, how likely is it that the Broncos make an aggressive push for him? We do a comparison because everyone is split on, do we bring back Von Miller if you're Broncos country, or do you look into Chandler Jones? We make the case coming up here in just a moment. But first, let me tell you about BetOnline.net, the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. And it's that time of year again as college basketball's tournament is finally upon us. And from all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline is the number one source for all your sports betting needs and information. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your continued source for all your upcoming sport wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Should the Denver Broncos invest heavily in Chandler Jones here in free agency? Can they convince him to come to Denver? As we continue on in the fourth quarter episode of today's episode, Locked on Broncos, just want to say thank you so much, Broncos country, once again for being here with us here today. Make sure you're subscribing or you're following this podcast, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts. Also here on YouTube. Sayre, a lot of the conversation right now is really aimed around Chandler Jones and his impact, because we've seen Benjamin Albright kind of report that the Broncos will have interest. We've also seen reports there that Von Miller wants to come back to the Denver Broncos. And with that, we've also seen reports that have suggested that the Broncos are not particularly interested in bringing back Von Miller at this point, even if Von wants to come back. So it's like for Broncos country, they're seeing all this and like, what does Denver do here? And so let's take a look here at both players here, starting off with Chandler Jones. And I think, Sayre, I just want to say here, I think Chandler Jones could be a championship chess move here for the Broncos. As we've talked about it here this week, we've seen a lot of teams be reactionary. We've seen the LA Chargers go out and trade for Khalil Mack. So now the Broncos are going to have to deal with Khalil Mack. They're going to have to deal with Joey Bosa. But let's take a look here at Chandler Jones. And look, if Bradley Chubb can emerge and be healthy and be the guy that the Broncos drafted him to be, man, they could have a very special duo on their hands there. So let's take a look at Chandler Jones here. 2019, Sayre. Okay, he led the NFL in sacks, 19 sacks that season for the Arizona Cardinals. He had 40 pressures on the quarterback alone, and he had 26 total quarterback hits. That is ridiculous production from him. I mean, we've seen him even going back to when he was a New England Patriot. He was an impact player off the edge. He was very dangerous in the way that Bill Belichick used him. And same thing when he went to the Arizona Cardinals. He just continued to ramp up that production more and more and more. And in 2020, though, we saw him play 5 games before suffering a season-ending injury. And in those 5 games, he had 1 sack, 7 QB hits, and 10 pressures. So kind of like a median spark there. It's really hard to project how things would have gone. But in 2021, we saw him return from that injury. And the first game of the season, he had 5 sacks alone against the Tennessee Titans. He finished last year with 10.5 sacks, 26 quarterback hits, and 36 total quarterback pressures. You and I were talking about it when we were previewing it. Quarterback hits, quarterback pressures are very, very important stats. Everyone's going to look at sacks, but, these 2 other stats are probably more important than sacks alone. And that's what the Broncos need. They need someone who can get pressure after the QB.
They do. And Chandler Jones is also one of the best in the NFL at finishing the quarterback in terms of getting that ball out. I mean, he gets that football out pretty regularly. So that's kind of a crazy stat. I don't know the exact number, Cody, of forced fumbles that he's had in his career, but it's hefty. I mean, he gets a lot of those. So strip sack is kind of Chandler Jones' thing. That's what he's known for. That's why I've had the Cardinals defense a couple of times in fantasy, and you love to see it because Chandler Jones is always causing trouble out there for other. And I think if there is one player, maybe not just one, but if there is one player, I think that Broncos fans could be like, oh, yeah, we can get on board for Chandler Jones, like as opposed to Von Miller. It makes you wonder, though, Cody, because I know we've talked about this before. Like, does George Paton really let this get out of the building? If the Broncos are truly, if they're truly interested in Chandler Jones, which I would believe, they do have genuine interest in him. I choose to believe that. I think that's legit. But at the same time, is he their number one target? Should we really believe that they don't have as much interest in re-signing Von Miller based on what Von Miller has kind of showed us? Or is this all misdirection for somebody else? And who would that be, right? So I think that those are the things that we're asking. But to me, it seems odd. Like, does this add up for you? And I want to hear your opinion on this, Cody. Like, does it add up for you that they would spend the money on Chandler Jones, he's gonna cost the same as Von Miller? I mean, it's gonna almost be identical it's just my guess. So they're gonna cost roughly the same. They're about a year's apart in age. Does it make sense to you that George Paton would say, no to Von Miller and absolutely yes to Chandler Jones?
It's very interesting that you say that because, you're spot on. And we've been talking about it here on the show. Like, there's not a lot of leaks that come out of George Paton's front office. Like, if George Paton wants people to know, he lets them know. But it's usually when everybody else finds out about the news. He's been very tight-lipped since coming in as a GM. So part of me is wondering about these reports, right? Like, who's saying it? A lot of times we see a lot of agents drop a lot of interest. A lot of agents do leak this information. So, I know that, Ben's close with a lot of agents. I have great relationships with several agents all across the league too. And there's times they tell me stuff that I can't really say because they're like, hey, off the record, we do this. It's like, this is smoke and mirror season. A lot of times they will do whatever they can. Agents are, because it's part of their job, to drop a strong interest here for their clients. So, hey, how much pressure does it put on maybe Chandler Jones to be like, hey, this team is potentially interested in me, but there's also Super Bowl MVP, 2-time Super Bowl champion Von Miller. Could he return to Denver? Things are, like I said, Sayre, I mean, 2 + 2 does not equal 4 in this situation here. There's some confusion because George Paton definitely does not let things get out of that building. So, I don't know. I think it makes free agency a little bit more appealing for us, man. But, if you had to choose right now, let's say, coming down to the final minute, you have to submit a text message. Let's say you got the draft sent and you have to send it because this is what's going to make the move official. If you had to choose between Chandler Jones and Von Miller, Sayre, where are you leaning?
I would definitely go with Von Miller, Cody, and that may just be my nostalgia talking. That may just be the orange and blue blood talking, or whatever you want to call it. However everybody wants to see it. I don't think there's necessarily you can't really accuse that as being like a homerish take or anything. Von Miller's still playing at an elite level. Yeah. Obviously now the Broncos are in a championship window or a competing window. And so Von Miller's a championship caliber move, just like Chandler Jones would be to me. So I would say Von Miller, just for the sake of, he knows the guys in the locker room. He knows Ejiro Evero very well. They've just worked together pretty much. So I would say that makes a lot of sense to me. And out of left field, Cody, I'm coming out of left field with a trade for Danielle Hunter of the Vikings. I think that's the one thing, we haven't heard anything connecting George Paton to that, although we did hear on Saturday that the Vikings are potentially shopping him. So that to me is a name to keep an eye on for the Denver Broncos in terms of this trade market and things like that, as somebody that's got connections going back. So, but if it was up to me, I would take Von Miller and I would say, let's run this thing back, man. And let's try to win another Super Bowl with Von on the roster.
Well, what do you say to that, Broncos country? It's expected to be a very busy week this week for the Denver Broncos, the rest of the National Football League. And one thing is for certain, all the coverage you need on all things orange and blue, you can get here at the Locked On Broncos podcast, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format. You can get us here in video format on YouTube. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. What moves will the Denver Broncos make next? Both Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we are going to have you covered, and we are just as excited as you are. That'll do it for today's episode of Locked On Broncos. In case anything major happens, there may be an emergency podcast. We'll have you covered here on the show.